because biology is such a huge field of study, you can't just memorize everything. In fact, you can't even just memorize most things. And yeah, okay, there are some equations and processes, i.e. Krebs cycle, and enzymes such as hexokinase or Rubisco that you should memorize or should at least try to memorize a significant fraction of. But besides those, no. For an exhibit of how dumb some people can get in terms of dealing with memorization in science, this is the ideal gas law, or expressed mathematically at least. I have known people who claim that they know people. I know, that sounds kind of interesting, but some people do in fact ask others, I know people who do that, to memorize 4 different versions of this thing, just based on which variable they need and which ones they already have. P, V, N, and T are the 4 variables in this. That is not a good way to learn this scientific law. In fact, it's kind of hard to get much worse. Now, instead of that, I just memorize this thing and then just slap it in and then substitute and move things around as needed. That's a much better way, by basically learning the general idea and theme and then putting it together as needed. Now, as for putting things together, please note that on major contests, there is a very large element of the most important life skill that one can possibly have, which is synthesis of knowledge. There is a one-word version of it, which happens to mean cow manure, but I think you get the point. So synthesis of knowledge is what allowed me to still get marks for a dissection of a bivalve at the International Biology Olympiad 2012 when I was out of time. Why? I couldn't find the heart. I couldn't find the digestive tract either of that thing. So I knew that the digestive tract in bivalves is supposed to pass through the heart. The question was multiple choice, and it said, is the digestive tract above the heart, below the heart, or through the heart? I chose through the heart. They gave me the marks. They did not in fact inspect whether or not I had dissected the thing. That's not how marking the practicals works at the Olympiad. So let's cover some of our themes and ideas that we will be using throughout this course. Theme: emergent properties in the biological hierarchy. Well, what is the biological hierarchy? Well, there is a few levels. So we start with the biosphere at the top, and then we go down and we can say biome if we want, or we can go straight down to ecosystem, as many textbooks do, because biomes are basically similar climatic conditions providing roughly similar ecosystems. Now, it is possible to consider, say, the boreal forest of North America one big ecosystem. However, you can also consider the boreal forest to be a biome, and it is continuous with Asia's boreal forest biome, and of course Northern Europe. So biosphere, biome, optional, and ecosystems, mandatory, because ecosystems are the last level where the biological hierarchy interacts directly with non-living things. Well, includes non-living things, because technically organisms interact with non-living things, such as me with this screen. So this is, as you can tell, non-living. Alright. So, ecosystems include non-living things. Communities do not include non-living things. Communities are just the populations of organisms that live in a particular area. And below communities, what do we have? We have populations, we have organisms or individuals. Then under that we have organ systems, and then organs, depending on the type of organism. And beyond that we have tissues, and then we have cells, and under cells we have organelles, as the case may be. Some organisms are not considered to have organelles, but for the most part, if you observe bacteria carefully, you will see that, hey, a cell wall is technically an organelle, right? I mean, we do count it as one on, say, eukaryotes. And then below organelles, we have molecules. Now, yes, okay, organelles can also have their own compartments. For example, thylakoid membranes in chloroplasts. But, well, that's usually not listed in the hierarchy, just as organ system actually often isn't listed in the hierarchy. So, in greater detail, in the biological hierarchy, we have the biosphere at the top. The biosphere is everywhere where life exists on Earth. If you want to go higher, you end up in astrobiology, and that kind of overlaps a great deal with astrophysics and other space-related fields. So that's a different matter. Now, the biosphere is detectable from a very large distance. So you may have seen the photo, the pale blue dot. Pale blue dot. From much farther away than the photo pale blue dot, well, it is already detectable that there is probably life on Earth. For example, you can detect water vapor. That's important. You can detect that the planet size is small. That is also important. So it's not likely to be a gas giant. It's also not likely to have a runaway greenhouse effect, like, say, Venus. Because if it doesn't have too thick an atmosphere, and it is not inside of the habitable zone, i.e. where liquid water could potentially exist on the surface, and you can already detect signs of water vapor, well, that's a good thing. So given spectrometry, well, it is possible to detect, say, reduced carbon and molecular oxygen. What do those two things usually end up with when put together? Whoosh, pretty much. So, combustion. Or, well, if proceeding at a slower rate, or in more general terms, oxidation. Now, we do point out that the biosphere can be divided into biomes before we divide it into ecosystems. So biomes are usually groups of ecosystems. Usually this is how it's defined. Of ecosystems with similar climatic conditions. Systems with similar climates. So for example, we can consider the taiga/boreal forest. Some places divided into taiga and boreal. Some places just count them all as taiga. Some places count all of them as boreal. Whatever. Now, we have that. We have chaparral. We have, well, say, deciduous forest. We have rainforest. We have tropical dry forest, and so on. Now, ecosystems are usually a little bit more specific than biomes. Like, for example, the open steppes of Asia versus the North American plains. They are separate ecosystems for the simple reason that they don't connect together. Now, you can consider all of the boreal forests in North America to be one big ecosystem. You can consider the open ocean to be one big ecosystem. But you can also consider a single fallen log to be one ecosystem. So this is the last level that includes the abiotic parts in the biological hierarchy. Then we have, well, okay, that's the abiotic in the sense of not a product of organisms or a component of organisms, because obviously everything below cell is technically abiotic by the definition of life as semi-autonomous at least, so parasites also count, and capable of reproducing independently of, say, a host. So viruses do not count, whereas obligate parasitic bacteria do. So communities. All the living organisms within a particular ecosystem, or sometimes a particular area. So the community of organisms that live in Yellowstone Park, that's a community. Now what happens if we talk about only the deer that live in, say, Quebec? Well, that would be a population. Now, technically speaking, the population should mean that these are individuals that can interbreed, i.e. they're living in comparable locations. So say buffalo, well, they actually used to have one big population. Now they have a few pockets. And I mean buffalo as in North American bison. So, alternatively, of course, it could just mean a particular area. Please be careful. Now, an organism is an individual living thing. Now, this could range in size from the largest organisms on Earth, which are underground fungi. So the total fungal mass is much, much bigger than, say, trees. Well, not the trees of the forest as much as a single tree. And then the next competitor would be, say, poplar stands, where they clone themselves and are connected by the roots. That could be considered one big superorganism. And it can go all the way down to a single bacterium, which can get really, really quite small. So 0.1 micrometers is possible for even a free-floating bacterium, Pelagobacter in this case, which we'll mention later. Now, organs and organ systems. Well, depending on who you ask, you can organize this into two levels: organ systems, organs. Now, of course, these only really apply to complex multicellular organisms, and they perform particular functions of varying complexity. Organs consist of multiple tissues. This is the important distinguishing trait between a specialized tissue and an organ. So, a leaf can be considered an organ because it has ground tissue, vascular tissue, and dermal or epidermal, depending on who you ask. What about animals? Well, tissues have distinct cellular structures. Sometimes they're particularly obvious, such as skin, bone, muscles, and blood from, say, a piece of meat that you're about to eat. Of course, the blood should be cooked, otherwise this would probably not be healthy. Tissues usually require a microscope to distinguish, but in some cases, well, they are rather obvious. So what are the four types of tissue in animals? Nervous, muscular, epithelial, and connective, also known as everything else, including, say, the skeleton. So cells are the fundamental unit of life in terms of structure and organization. Now, many organisms are single cells, some of which can reproduce sexually. Yes, single cells are capable of reproducing sexually. Consider looking up certain protists before we get to that section. Of course, once we get there, it'll immediately be obvious how single cells can reproduce sexually, such as how paramecium does it. Paramecium actually has to reproduce sexually once per 50 to 200 generations, depending on the various strains. Now, of course, that's just a general range. There are ones that can be capable of more, but, well, overall, that's it. Now, cells can range from about 0.1 micrometers, which is for Pelagibacter ubique, so named because it was found in the sea. Pelagic zone is basically the term for open water, whereas littoral zone is for near shore, hence, say, the US Navy's new littoral combat ship. Ubique is for ubiquitous, so it is everywhere. It is estimated to be the most abundant bacterium on Earth. It is estimated to occupy as much as 50% of the cell count in seawater, depending on conditions. So sometimes it does, other times it's less, much less. Now, it is estimated that there is more Pelagibacter ubique in the ocean than the total mass of fish in the sea. Cells can range up in size to the size of dinosaur eggs, because a just fertilized egg, or an unfertilized egg, is a single cell. Admittedly, this probably sounds like a sort of cheating. But did you know that even prokaryotes can grow large enough to be visible to the naked eye? Well, you're free to search it up, but that's not what we're here for now. All right, organelles. Well, organelles can include chloroplasts, which come in various shapes. Some organisms have, say, a cup-shaped chloroplast that almost wraps around their nucleus. Some of them have ribbon-like chloroplasts. Some have chloroplasts that are in separate discs. Some of them have one long continuous one. Mitochondria, on the other hand, usually have a fairly consistent shape pattern. In other words, basically like a bacillus for the most part. Yeah, okay, sometimes they bend, but that's not too often. And there are other specialized compartments or apparatuses, such as the Golgi apparatus, within cells. Now, prokaryotes also have organelles. For example, they have flagella, they have cell walls, they have magnetosomes, they have carboxysomes, and so on. Of course, it was previously believed that prokaryotes did not have organelles. The main difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote, really, nowadays, is the fact that a eukaryote has a membrane-enclosed nucleus. The prokaryote does not. It has a nucleoid region, though, where the DNA mostly stays. Molecules. Well, this is the level of organization under organelles. So individual molecules, which are two or more atoms joined together. And what can a molecule do? Well, it can float around, depending on its size, shape, whatever, because technically proteins can be just one big molecule. So a many thousands of atomic mass units molecule. So molecules float around in solution. They're not really affected all that much by gravity under Earth conditions. Of course, in a centrifuge, it's somewhat different. But so they float around and they bump into other molecules. Depending on shape, conformation, speed, and so on, speed being, say, kinetic energy, they may or may not react with one another. And so basically all of life, it consists of molecules semi-randomly ramming into each other, segregated into particular compartments to increase their chances of ramming each other the right way, or not ramming ones that they aren't supposed to run into. And, well, That doesn't sound very optimistic, does it, in terms of a view of life? Well, returning to our theme of emergent properties, it's pretty obvious that you can't study an important function of life, such as photosynthesis, with a pile of chloroplast fragments. You have to have working chloroplasts to actually see what certain things do to the photosynthetic rate. I mean, yes, if you break it down into a bunch of fragments, you can see, oh, which fragments can conduct which parts of the reaction. Sure, but to actually photosynthesize and to see how you can affect photosynthesis itself as a whole process, that still requires chloroplasts. Because one chemical you might add that might, say, accelerate a particular step when you have a test tube packed with parts, well, that might actually be poisonous to another step in the process, which would be, of course, bad for overall photosynthetic rate. Now, emergent properties are also present in non-living things to usually a much less degree than in living things. For example, in an experiment in the late 20th century, they wanted to use a common root surface clinging bacterium to digest cellulose from dead plants into alcohol faster. The problem with their experiments using that bacterium was that when they tried to add it to a soil culture that contained actual plants, all the plants died because the concentration of alcohol those bacteria could produce and tolerate was many times that the plants could tolerate. Which means that if they release that very aggressive soil bacterium into the wild, it could potentially have resulted in the extinction of all land life, except fungi. So, reductionism, reducing complex systems to simpler, manageable parts, is a powerful tool in biology, but of course it is not all powerful. It is very important to observe these emergent properties, which include the fact that, say, in non-living things, graphite in pencils versus diamonds, the only difference is the molecular structure. The atoms are exactly the same. Well, not exactly the same, but, well, they're the same type of atoms. They are considered identical. That does not mean the same, as much as, say, identical twins are not the same person. Of course, in inorganic examples, non-living things, well, it tends to be very simple in terms of emergent properties compared to biological systems, which are much more complicated because they just contain so many more parts and many more different types of parts. By the way, a common example for an emergent property is a box of bicycle parts. They say that a box of bicycle parts is unlikely to take you anywhere. I disagree. It's likely to take you on a quest to find a wrench and a screwdriver. Now, holistic? What is holistic? This means looking at the whole thing. How do you think the word holistic came to be accepted? It's because looking at the whole thing. Whole. Okay, fine, holistic, whatever. Let's do that. That's one way to think about how it became accepted. And honestly, most people could not care less. Alright, so holistic perspectives allow us to see how parts interact in a living system, which is something that reductionism doesn't really do all that well a lot of the time. However, sometimes reductionism actually works. For example, figuring out the structure of the DNA strand provided Watson and Crick an obvious mode of replication. So we know that it's two helices wrapped together, so a double helix. What happens if we unwind this and replicate each one and then wind them back together separately? So, well, that's called semi-conservative replication. It actually took a while for people to figure out that it had to be semi-conservative instead of conservative, which was this one unwinds, it gets copied, the new one's assembled together, and the old one assembles back together, or dispersive, as in it gets chopped into chunks, and each chunk resynthesizes its opposing part. The people who thought it was dispersive apparently never quite realized, like, how do we piece the chunks back together? Oh well. Sometimes scientists can be alarmingly short on actual thinking. For example, the alcoholic root bacterium problem. Alright, systems biology tries to model dynamic behavior, so behavior that's constantly changing with lots of changing parts, based on a study of interactions among the system's parts. This often uses computer modeling. So we know that interactions between cells in an ant's body or any other organism, or any other system for that matter, cannot be observed properly if you just have a list of parts. So just knowing what vehicles are in a city doesn't tell you how the city runs. Just knowing what people are there and what buildings there are, what streets there are, how big they are, where the accidents are, and where the blockages are, that doesn't tell you how the system runs. You need some sort of analytical system, i.e. computer model, to be able to model it well. Alright, so other problems that might be answered by systems biology other than traffic control, and there is a very interesting traffic model that can be shown and animated on, say, Wikipedia. Another problem might be how blood thinner could affect other organs throughout the body. So even larger and more pressing issues, well, there's a matter of climate change. So an increase in carbon dioxide level will affect the climate. This was understood even in the late 1800s. Now, of course, people were under the impression that either humans couldn't affect the climate that much, because apparently Earth is special or something, and science people had problems believing in scientists' analyses. So either that, or they just thought that internal combustion engines were too convenient. Admittedly, despite the fact that in 1900 the most common type of car on the road was electric, those batteries were huge, to say the least. And they weren't very good in terms of energy density. Do you know why lead-acid batteries are still used in cars today? For starting the engines, and of course for powering the spark plugs? It's because they are good for quick surges of power. In terms of the amount of power they can store per battery, they are really bad. They are good for quick surges of power, and they are good for being recharged and discharged many, many times. Hence why they are used in cars and, well, diesel-electric submarines and so on. In diesel-electric submarines, they can be, well, the batteries with varying battery technologies, all of which were rather bulky and large. They could be big. On a ship or on a boat, space is not that much of an issue, and weight is not that much of an issue, which, by the way, is why marine diesels are used more commonly than engines on land, despite the fact that diesel engines are well known to be much more efficient than gasoline engines and more stable in terms of burning. Interestingly, jet fuel happens to basically all be in the diesel range. Well, theme. Well, organisms interact with living and non-living things. Alright, let's draw us a tree. So here's the ground, and here's the tree's root system. So usually trees' roots occupy about as much space as the crown above. So what living and non-living things might this tree interact with? Well, there's a wind. Oh, there could be pollen from another tree carried by bees or wind or whatever. And there could be herbivores such as people being unhelpful and eating fruit from the tree. Or leaves, or stripping bark, such as, say, willow bark. Of course, willows do not look like this, but hey. And what other living things? Well, there could be worms that gnaw away at its roots. There could be beetles, there could be caterpillars, and so on. Now, for non-living things, there could be stuff like, oh, the soil has rocks in it. So the roots have to go around the rocks. And it could rain. Now, did you know that a significant part of the rainfall that gets blocked by a tree goes down its trunk flow? So when it's raining, first of all, if there's a thunderstorm, do not take shelter under trees because of the risk of lightning strikes. But if it's just raining and you are under a tree, you might want to observe the trunk and notice how a lot of the water that gets blocked by the leaves actually ends up flowing down along the trunk. So leaning against the trunk when it's raining is a bad idea if you don't want to get wet. Which is probably why you're standing under a tree in the first place, right? Alright, as organisms, humans of course interact with our environment. Like certain other organisms, like cyanobacteria, we are not very good at noticing the consequences our interactions can wreak on the environment. Very drastic consequences. Cyanobacteria brought a drastic change to Earth's atmosphere by freeing up molecular oxygen. So, by photosynthesis. What about humans? Well, we've been freeing up carbon from where it's been locked up underground, and this has induced very fast climate change. Now, climate change is perfectly normal. Man-made climate change is not. The climate changes slowly over time, all the time. It is not constant. But changing things too fast is a bad idea. For example, you know full well that when winter comes, you get thicker and thicker clothes over time. That means, for plant and animal terms, that's basically adaptation or relocation. I.e., say plants. It's getting colder and colder. The seeds that they send southward, that they spread southward, advance the forest, like it basically moves the forest south as it gets colder. Well, this is of course assuming we're in the northern hemisphere. So when it gets warmer, like when the last ice age ended, well, the plants had to creep back north, not by the forest getting up and walking like certain movies would depict, but by seeds. So seeds get over there, they grow. Many years later, they spread more seeds further north. Those grow and they move further north. So trees move very slowly. That is okay with natural rates of change. With human-made rates of change, it's like taking somebody from a swimming pool in the middle of summer and suddenly throwing them into a refrigerated room. This is not good for their health, for hopefully obvious reasons. Hopefully, I realize that this here sounds hopelessly optimistic, but unlike other organisms, hopefully we are intelligent enough to actually figure out cause and effect. In other words, putting more carbon into atmosphere equals messing up climates that we are used to even further. And overall, it's going to warm up because we knew since the late 1800s that more carbon dioxide means more greenhouse effect. But of course, yeah, some places are going to end up cooling, but overall it'll end up warming. So hopefully we will be intelligent enough to do something about this problem before we go too far. Now, we point out that rapid climate change, in addition to inducing problems in terms of adaptation and moving plants fast enough, it could also induce many outright extinctions. For example, the eruption of the Deccan Traps in India had the dinosaurs in decline even before the Yucatan impact finally finished them off because of a period of rapid climate change. Our climate change is actually comparable, at least in terms of speed, to something like the Deccan Traps. So at least these two things are within reasonable shouting distance of one another, which is very impressive given the Deccan Traps have been advertised as basically an area the size of Siberia spewing out lava and ash and so on for a long time. Alright. So another theme that we will use in this course is that life requires energy transfer and transformation. You may have heard of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that the entropy of the universe can only increase. Law of thermodynamics. Entropy of universe always observed to increase. Universe always rises. So life is basically exploiting steps along this rise in chaos to create pockets of order. Now, we know that other than this, which is, by the way, why it costs energy to maintain the structures that support life, organisms also spend energy to do work, to do other work, such as me throwing this and failing to catch it somehow. There, better. So, well, me talking at you makes your ears do work, in the sense that they have to send an electrical impulse to your brain, right? Well, not quite. Why? Because the actual work done was in those neurons before the impulse was sent along by, say, the sodium-potassium pump, which maintains the chemiosmotic gradient that allowed them to conduct that impulse. Of course, it is true that there are small muscles attached to the bones of the inner ear that help amplify the sound, but that's another matter. Another theme is that structure and function are always correlated. For example, the hollow bones of birds are to save weight, or mass rather, to allow them to actually fly. Now, why do you think red blood cells are not spherical, but are instead biconcave discs? Well, the biconcave disc allows the maximum possible surface area for gas exchange while still remaining at least somewhat hydrodynamic. Whereas a sphere Why do you think manhole covers are round? They are round because a circle is the only two-dimensional shape that cannot fit inside itself. What this means is that it is not possible for somebody to pick up a manhole cover and then drop it down into the sewer, which is, of course, very bad. Now, we do know that smaller sewer grates may or may not be round. So many of them are rectangular. Why is this the case? Well, it's because manhole covers were designed to be removed completely for access. Whereas smaller ones, at most you're going to lift them up and then stick some sort of instrument down there to try to clean it a little bit. Alright, so what else can we think of besides that? The one that links with the next theme. Well, the cell is surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer. Form follows function. The phospholipid bilayer of an organism, well, it has the function of keeping what's inside inside and what's outside outside. Hence why it is a bilayer, so that the hydrophobic parts inside separate the ion environment, like say Na+, of outside from the ion environment inside the cell, which is of course quite different. Most cells tend to have more potassium inside than outside, and more sodium outside than inside, at least in, say, humans. Now contemplate and contrast a eukaryotic and prokaryotic cell. Well, a eukaryote is usually much bigger. It has a membrane-enclosed nucleus. A prokaryote does not. It has a nucleoid region, though. Now, a prokaryote usually has much fewer organelles, unless, of course, this is one of those prokaryotes that have flagella literally all over the place. Then it might actually have more. Of course, that's if we don't count ribosomes as an organelle. And then we have an endoplasmic reticulum, which we're going to draw here in terms of just diagram purposes, pretty much. The endoplasmic reticulum actually extends throughout the cytoplasm, and there's smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which basically looks like a kind of web. So a bunch of tubes, instead of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which usually looks flattened, like a bunch of stacked flattened discs. And then there's the actual stacks of flattened discs, such as, say, the Golgi apparatus. This is, of course, not exactly a very good drawing. And then we have, say, the mitochondrion. Now, mitochondria are known to be drawn with plenty of folds along the intermembrane. And, of course, we might have chloroplasts, but we aren't going to draw them for now. There are other organelles, such as, say, lysosomes. But they are a little bit hard to depict without just labeling as such, especially when they're not digesting anything. Now, the main difference really is the fact that eukaryotes have a membrane-bound nucleus. They can engulf other cells and then digest them, whereas prokaryotes do not have a membrane-bound nucleus, and typically their cell wall is too rigid to try to engulf anything. Now, on the other hand, they are capable of, in some cases, such as certain vibrios, which look like kind of like commas, of drilling into other prokaryotic cells while moving very quickly. Certain vibrios prey on, say, E. coli, which is a common inhabitant of the large intestine, and which have strains that are so distantly removed from the E. coli that we're familiar with, that those strains of E. coli are farther, genetically speaking, than a human versus a platypus. So, a vibrio may ram into an E. coli and drill at a high speed until it bores its way through the cell wall, and then it digests the E. coli inside its own cell wall. It absorbs these nutrients and it forms several more vibrios by cell division. And in the end, they all drill out through the cell wall of the E. coli and go hunting for more other bacteria to consume. Now, the continuity of life is based on heritable information. Usually this heritable information is DNA. Sometimes it can be RNA. Because we do treat viruses as having heritable information, even though they are not considered to be alive. This is a very important point. Now, life, on the other hand, is, of course, entirely DNA-based. At least modern life that we can see nowadays. Archaea, which are the other domain besides domain bacteria of prokaryotes, and eukarya and bacteria, they are all DNA-based. There is no more RNA-based life around, but heritable information can still be RNA. Alright, so besides that, we have concepts that are related to dealing with DNA. So here we start with gene expression. Gene expression is the entire process by which you take a gene's information, starting with the DNA, and eventually end up with a functioning either RNA product, or protein product, or glycoprotein, or whatever. So this includes all the way from unraveling the DNA from its compact state, to transcribing it, and then translating it, translating the RNA message, to make a polypeptide, cutting the polypeptide appropriately, and of course not scrapping it in the process, and, then releasing it, depending on where you want it, say in the cytoplasm, or into the ER, which then may export it to the Golgi apparatus for modification with, say, sugar residues, so to make a glycoprotein, or, something else. So gene expression is a pretty blanket term. The genome is all the genetic information an organism has. So this includes, depending on definition, usually it'll include plasmids, which can be acquired during an organism's life and is not inherited by the organism from an ancestor. Or may be not inherited, rather. Because some plasmids are replicated by say, bacterium, and will be passed down to descendants. Genomics are the large-scale analysis of DNA sequences. So, in other words, the study of whole genomes. So, genomes between species, or, you can study large blocks of genes within a species at a time under genomics. So say, we think that all these human globin genes, say alpha hemoglobin, beta hemoglobin, various embryonic forms and fetal forms of hemoglobin, those are all related globins. In fact, those are also related distantly to myoglobin, which is the particular protein that gives, red muscle or red meat the red color. It also binds oxygen like hemoglobin does. Now, it binds oxygen as a twofold purpose. One is to provide the muscles with oxygen when the blood isn't supplying enough. The other is to make the concentration of oxygen inside muscles lower. Now, you might think, hey, that sounds incredibly stupid. Why? Wait a second. When blood is passing by and it's like, looks outside, the muscle cell has enough oxygen in it for now. It's pretty much full of oxygen. Great. Nothing gets dropped off. No diffusion happens overall. Whereas if myoglobin locks up oxygen as it arrives and only releases enough for the muscle to use, then the blood is constantly offloading oxygen into the muscle, which is good, so that exhaustion doesn't set in too quickly. By the way, that's part of why fast twitch glycolytic fibers versus fast twitch oxidative are white versus red. Oxidative uses oxygen to break down, well, glucose, whereas glycolytic only has glycolysis, which is an anaerobic process. That's good for the first few contractions, especially because the glycolytic fibers are the thickest, and thus each individual fiber contracting provides more force than one oxidative fiber contracting. But, well, overall, over time, it is oxidative fibers that really provide most of our power. Now, bioinformatics. So this uses computational tools. So it's informatics. Come on, information technology, IT. In other words, computers. So this uses modern computers to quickly analyze large amounts of data from what they still call high throughput sequencing, which basically uses modern computer and chemical equipment to quickly analyze, well, say, whole genomes. Now, this also involves bringing in other experts, such as, say, engineers, chemists, mathematicians, and of course, computer tech people. So these things put together, these three aspects, made what we call genomics today possible. Otherwise, it would have been unreasonable to analyze all the data that could be obtained from, say, well, these first two. Another theme that we can find in biology, and basically all the time do, is feedback mechanisms. Well, there are two types, feedback. You've probably heard of feedback in terms of, oh, teacher feedback for student performance, or student feedback for teacher performance. Well, here, positive feedback means that, say we have a particular process. So the end product goes back and enhances a particular step of the process. So it makes it go faster and faster to pile up more and more end product. And thus the reaction proceeds to completion. Now, very few biological processes do this. Giving birth to offspring is one of them. So to get it finished. Well, excretion might also be one if you think about it that way, but, well, that's another matter. And the other type of feedback is negative. This is much more common. The other type of feedback is to have either an intermediate or the final product go back and inhibit a step that is usually near the beginning, if not the first step of this reaction chain. This way you don't waste stuff going in if you already have enough. For example, amino acid synthesis will not synthesize more of certain amino acids if there is already enough in the organism. Now, why might negative feedback be so much more common? It's because organisms use negative feedback to maintain relatively stable internal conditions. So say body temperature. If it gets too warm, a feedback system kicks in terms of cool the body down. And then once it gets close enough, the negative feedback shuts down that system. And then if it gets too cold, a thermostat system, is a biological thermostat. So this thing tells the body to say shiver to warm up, and eventually when it gets warm enough, a feedback system turns the shivering response off. The unifying theme in all of biology is evolution. This is the one thing that makes sense of basically everything to do with life. So the fact that life on Earth has been evolving for billions of years provides for the fact that there is a lot of diversity to be observed. Why do we say billions of years? Well, first of all, we can estimate time of genetic divergence between organisms, or clades of organisms. We can also use radial dating of, say, zircon crystals to estimate the age of very old rocks, and of course the approximate age of the solar system. Now, the genetic code, homologous bone structure among, say, vertebrates, homologous structures and genes in general among, say, arthropods, although those are so diverse and earlier than vertebrates that they are much more diverse. They're a little bit harder to find homology in, but the general structure of, say, an insect remains that of an insect, so 6 limbs. Now, dragonflies have 4 wings, 2 pairs. Dipterans, for example, have 2 wings and 2 halteres, which are used for balance when flying, among other things. So, overall, the common amino acids, common genetic code, and so on point to a common origin for life on Earth and descent with modification in many diverse directions. Now, there is no scientifically admissible evidence that disagrees with evolution. In fact, all scientific evidence points that it is continuing today. So say antibiotic-resistant bacteria or pesticide-resistant pests. These are signs that existing variation in the population has been amplified. So suppose we start with a population of bacteria. Some of them are a little bit resistant to an antibiotic. They have a much higher chance of surviving when the antibiotic is introduced than the ones that are vulnerable. So the population that results is going to be a little bit more resistant, provided those bacteria are not actually killed off successfully. By the way, this is a common problem in, say, prisons. Tuberculosis is a common disease among prisoners. Their antibiotic regimens usually are not taken for long enough to actually cure them, and thus the remaining more resistant bacteria get to survive and reproduce and infect more people. Thus, eventually, we get multi-drug resistant tuberculosis. That is, of course, a somewhat simplified mechanism, but the point remains that we do have to note, though, that it is accepted that in the ancient past, at some point, life arose from non-life. Now, this is a process that most likely required a reducing atmosphere instead of the current oxidizing atmosphere, because oxidizing atmospheres would attack unprotected biological molecules. There's a reason why tetanus bacteria can grow in injuries, and it has to do with the fact that, in fact, human tissue is not all that rich in oxygen. Now, of course, there are other chemical requirements as well for the formation of early life, and it required time pretty much beyond human imagining. A human can imagine what 10 years is like. A human can even imagine with some effort what 100 years is like. But when they start talking about 1,000 years, 10,000 years, these are words that are basically just words to a person. Humans are famously bad with large numbers. For example, to save one goose to a human seems more visible and more personal than saving a flock of 2,000 geese. So, to say 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years, these are basically concepts that the human mind is not equipped to really comprehend. We can imagine them, we can think of them, we can talk about them, but do we actually understand how unimaginably long a period of time that is? How many different little bubbles of phospholipid bilayers formed before one happened to form that had some level of self-replication ability and actually had the chance to replicate itself? Well, after the first self-replicator arose, it's pretty obvious that the ones that are best able to replicate themselves successfully and pass on their information to offspring are going to be the ones that end up getting their information passed down to offspring. And thus, their frequency in the population will increase. And of course, yeah, this copying process is imperfect, but these mutations, most of them are bad. Most of them don't work. The cells just die. But some of them might provide a little advantage. And a little advantage over a long period of time is all that's needed for it to arrive at fixation in the population. So all of the population has it. So the rest, as long as someone believes that forms of life can change over time, however slowly, then as long as someone understands how logic works, the rest is obvious. This is why one of Darwin's friends, after he published his book, and well, okay, it was partially Wallace's idea, but Wallace conceded that Darwin had it more fleshed out than he did. And besides, Wallace also became famous later. He got the Wallace line named after him. He also later became a bit of a fanatic on the other side, but that's another matter. So, Wallace and Darwin, their idea had one of Darwin's friends saying, "How very stupid not to have thought of that." And so despite Wallace eventually becoming a bit spiritualistic, well, he wasn't ever against evolution per se, but he didn't believe that stuff like mathematics and arts and such could arise naturally. Regardless, after billions of years, after a lot of chemical evolution of the planet, by freeing up oxygen, lots of new mineral forms could form. So, due to the effect of the organisms on it, the world has evolved chemically as well as biologically. So after billions of years of this, and a whole lot of random chance as well, because it is possible that the best adapted may not survive, here we are today. So some problems that we might have to do. Oh, list the levels in the hierarchy of biological organization. Well, then that's biosphere, biome, if you wish. Some areas specify biomes, others do not. Ecosystem. And then community. And population. And organism. And then we have the organ system. Organ, tissue, cell. And honestly, this is the end of well, biology, and then after that really is biochemistry. But for now, we consider that to still be part of biology because biochemistry is partially biology. So after the cell, we have the organelle. And then we have the molecule. So the cell is the fundamental building block of life. The organism is the fundamental unit of living things. Why? Because cells can be organisms. Organisms can be made up of many cells. But organisms can live independently. Cells, if they are not organisms, frequently cannot, in fact, live independently. Alright, what theme or themes? We'll answer this one verbally. The stinging spines of a nettle. Now, organisms interact with one another. That is why nettles have stinging spines. So, to dissuade herbivores. Now, this is also proof of evolution because to dissuade herbivores, they started off with spines that did not inject poison, and eventually they came up with spines that did inject poisons. So the cloning of several plants from a single cell. Well, here we see cell organisms undergoing growth and repair and such. But in general, this one is a matter of inheritance of information. Because we know that clones have identical genetic information. C. Oh hey, use of sugar to power an athlete's muscles. That means, well, wait a second. Organisms depend on energy flow and transformations to do anything, such as work and generally stay alive. So that's it for this section, and hopefully we will see that because technically a lot of the themes apply to each of these if we think deeper. Hopefully we will see that all these themes are in fact interspersed and are connected by the overarching unifying theme of evolution. In other words, the fact that life changes over time. Everything changes. So, see each other again later then.